Okay. All right. So want to just had a couple more examples of the acrostics I wanted to do. Just again, I think it's helpful to know where those places are in scripture that have these particular special structures. Remember, of course, acrostics being the where each verse or line of a poem starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In the last couple of sessions together, we've looked at some examples of that, where we had some examples of a perfect acrostic, which is basically every letter of the alphabet is used in order. We looked at some examples of that in the Psalms. Then we saw also there are other Psalms, other passages where they're not perfect acrostics. That is, sometimes there might be a letter that is missing, or that there's a switch in the order, or even just how many verses per letter. So we looked at some examples of that. There were two more examples I wanted to look at because there are some examples of this outside of the Psalms. One of them being Proverbs 31. We see here Proverbs 31. Hopefully you guys can see this on your screens. Right, the words of King Lemuel, which some believe may be a Solomon, just a pseudonym for Solomon. I'm not sure, but this is something his mother taught him. So here's actually a passage of scripture that was originated from a woman. Inspired text, of course, but this was Lemuel's mother. And then she gets to verse 10. And of course, we have the famous passage on the Proverbs 31 woman. But that passage is an acrostic, where each letter, again, begins with, is in order in the Hebrew alphabet. So if I show you from the Hebrew text, we'll see that very clearly. If I can expand this a little better. Okay, so starting in verse 10, notice we have Aleph, first letter of verse 10, Beth, the first letter of verse 11, Gimel, first letter of verse 12, Daleth, Hey, and all the way through to verse 22, or sorry, be 30, 31 in this case, which ends with Tau. That's the last letter. So it's a perfect acrostic, 22 verses, or 22 Hebrew letters, and they are given in order. And so this Proverbs 31 is actually also written with this acrostic structure. Again, for aesthetic value, to help with memorizing it. But it's one example of a perfect acrostic, and this is in the book of Proverbs, interestingly enough. There's another acrostic in Lamentations, the book of Lamentations. And this one is an interesting feature. And notice in the Legacy Standard Version, again, it tells you, it gives the indication even in the English text. But Lamentations is a very interesting book. If you'll notice, if we go to the Hebrew text, we can see each verse begins with, this is chapter 1. Each verse begins with the letter. So Aleph in verse 1, verse 2, Beth, verse 3, Gimel. We have Dalet in verse 4, He in verse 5, Wow in verse 6, and so on, all the way through to the end of the chapter, 22 verses. And notice Tau it ends with Tau. So we have a perfect acrostic in Lamentations chapter 1, and the same thing in Lamentations 2. Notice the beginning of verse 1, if I can line this up right, is Aleph, and then Beth, Gimel, Daleth, all the way. So chapter 2, same pattern. One verse per letter. But when we get to chapter 3, there's a change. So all the way verse chapter 2 has 22 verses, each beginning with the next letter. When we get to chapter 3, do you see anything different? Do you see a pattern there?
It became 3 verses per letter.
Yeah. So verse 1 begins with Aleph, verse 2, verse 3, and then verse 4 changes to Beth. Then verse 5, verse 6. And then when we get to verse 7, Gimel, 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 7, 8, 9. Verse 10, 11, 12. This is similar to Psalm 119, if you'll remember, right? Psalm 119 does the same kind of thing, except it does it 8 verses. Right? Aleph, 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 all the way to verse 8, and then Beth. Again, there's a shift. We see this in the English text here, Beth, verses 9 to 16, Gimel, verses 17 to 24. So in Lamentations, it does something similar, but it is 3 verses at a time. Oops. In chapter 3. If I can get there. So Aleph, verses 1, 2, and 3. Beth, verses 4, 5, and 6. And so does that all the way, chapter 3. And then chapter 4. So chapter 3 has 66 verses because there's 22 letters, 3 verses per letter. Then when we get to chapter 4, he goes back to the same pattern as chapters 1 and 2. Aleph, verse 1, Beth, verse 2, Gimel, verse 3, Daleth, verse 4, and so on. So he reverts back to the pattern that he had in chapters 1 to 3, or 1 and 2. But chapter 3, he changed. So again, remember what I said before. One of the interesting things about acrostics is to look for deviations from a pattern. And this is true in really any passage, especially in poetry, is to, if you see a pattern and then a change, that could be intentional by the author. And so in Lamentations, we have chapters 1 and 2 and 4 follow the same acrostic pattern, perfect acrostics, 1 letter per verse in order, all 22 letters. But chapter 3, he shifts and he changes to 3 verses per letter. Still does it in order, still a perfect acrostic, but he changed the pattern. So that's something to pay attention to and consider, and then ask the question, why did he do this? Was he just trying to mix things up to be different? Or was there perhaps another reason that Jeremiah did this? And for some way he wants to draw special attention to chapter 3. And I think when we consider the theme of Lamentations, remember chapter 3, what is the focus there? If we remember chapters 1 and 2, right? They're full of lament, how the city has been destroyed and the people have been ravaged and been under God's heavy hand. And then even as he hits chapter 3, I'm a man who's seen affliction because of his wrath, right? He's just talking about the suffering that he's experienced. And then comes the famous statement in verse 22. Fue, you want to read verses 22 to 24 here?
Okay, the Lamentation, chapter 3, verse 22. The loving kindness of Yahweh indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning, great in your faithfulness. Yahweh is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I wait for him.
Right, the famous hymn, Great is Your Faithfulness, comes from this chapter. And it's in this chapter where, of course, remember the pattern in laments, and we'll see this when we study the Psalms, is often the lament or the concern is brought up at the beginning. So the author talks about how they're suffering or situation, crying out to God for help. And again, that's what Jeremiah was doing in the first 2 chapters. He's describing their circumstance, crying out to God. And then even the beginning of chapter 3 continues that. And then verse 19 is where things shift. And this is typical in laments. You'll have the beginning of the poem in lament, and then there'll be a shift where the author moves from the lament to focusing attention on the whole tone changes. And that's what happens here. Remember my affliction and my homelessness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down. Therefore, I will return to my heart and I will wait in hope. Now things are changing. And this is where he begins to declare the loving kindness of God. And in verse 25, the goodness of God. Yahweh is good to those who hope in him, to the soul who seeks him. And so here is where this Jeremiah shifts in his lament from crying out to God to saying, I'm going to hope and wait and trust in God. And it's chapter 3 where that happens. And so I think we see Jeremiah shift in his structure to sort of match that shift in tone and shift in the book. And chapter 3 really is the hub or the hinge of the book, where it moves from the lament to the hope, the cry for hope and trust, the prayer of hope and trust. And so I think Jeremiah is highlighting, emphasizing this shift by changing the way he structured his poem, moving from the 1 letter per verse to 3 letters per verse. And then in chapter 4, he goes back to the 1 letter per verse. As he talks about Yahweh again, he turns back to the theme of Yahweh's judgment. All right, so chapters 1 and 2, Yahweh's judgment on his people and the suffering. Chapter 3 is hope in Yahweh. Chapter 4 goes back to Yahweh's judgment. And then chapter 5 is his final prayer, calling for God to remember. And chapter 5, there's no acrostic. He doesn't use it. Because again, there's a change. Now in chapter 5 is his direct prayer to God for help. So we even see how it seems like Jeremiah follows his thematic shifts, his changes in theme and focus. He follows that with how he structures his poem. And so we really can see the sections of this poem based on the structure. Chapters 1 to 2, he gives a perfect acrostic, 1 letter per verse. Chapter 3, he shifts to 3 verses per letter. And chapter 4, he goes back to 1 letter per verse. Then chapter 5, no acrostic. And so you can even see just by the poem, the acrostic structure, the structure of his poem, and it follows the theme. So they actually are a helpful guide in this case for seeing how the author himself identified the structure within his poem. Any questions on that or comments? You guys know about Lamentations?
Pastor Tim was just so fascinated in Lamentation 3 when in the July regional conference in Manila, I think it was it Jim Eyre?
Yeah.
Jim Eyre, right? I was just referring to my notes there. I think in fact, I was explaining to my son about this a few days ago, and likewise in in Proverbs 9, 7-2, when I think lamentation is an excellent example that not only we see the acrostic, but we also see some kind of chiastic structure in it as well, where chapter 3, verse 22 onwards, there is a shift from, as you said just now, from the punishments of God and the disastrous consequences of disobeying God and God's judgment, to recalling the hope in God, not because of ourselves, but because of his faithfulness, of his mercy. And that shift goes on until the remaining of chapter 3. What was also very fascinating to me is the clever use of the acrostic for chapter 1, 2, and 3, one verse, and then 3 verses, and then chapter 4, 1 verse. But come to chapter 5, there is no more acrostic. So the question I'm asking myself, why no more acrostic in chapter 5? Is Jeremiah saying that as God's judgment comes full on a rebellious nation, in his desperate prayer in chapter 5, it's like, when we are in the desperate situation, we are so in despair, we can't even speak properly. Our thoughts are all jumbled up. And he's saying that I do away with the acrostic. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, I think some do take that view that he stopped the acrostic structure because of the nature of that last chapter. It's really a focus, a cry for help. God, do something, do something. Yeah. So yeah, some believe that too was an intentional to demonstrate the emotion. Yeah. And I could see that. I don't think I would disagree with that. But you definitely see the way he structures each section matches the theme of the section. 1, 2, and 4 go together. Chapter 3 is unique. And then chapter 5 is unique as well. And so he uses that structure to really show the change. And yeah, chapter 5, he sort of throws out the structure and goes back to 3 verse, perhaps to match his own emotion. So yeah, it's an interesting book. It's a unique one in that sense, where you have every other poem where it shows acrostic is consistent with itself. It stays with the pattern with a few deviations. Lamentations is unique in how it shifts so significantly in the type of acrostics that he uses.
So what I found very beneficial to our class is to learn that when we read the poetic genre in the Old Testament in particular, or anywhere, but in this case of Lamentation, for example, one of the intentions of the author is to evoke emotions in his reader. Jeremiah could have just made a statement like Paul, God is faithful. He will deliver you, just a pure doctrinal statement, boom. But because by getting to see the acrostic and so on, it gets us in that emotion. And I think it draws us closer to God. It draws emotion out of us where how often we are in despair. I'm in despair. I don't know what's going to go on. I know that I'm sinful, but I know at the same time, God is faithful. And his mercies is new every morning. And often morning I woke up and say, God, I have not been snubbed up by you. It's a new mercy for today. Right? And being aware of our sinfulness and reading the poetic genre, by being able to get into the emotions, I think not only the internalizing, I can't even get my words right, internalizing the scripture into our life, but when we talk to our people and our children at home, the emotions that comes through. One of the things I learned many years ago is that the Sunday school children will not remember what the Sunday school teachers taught, but they will remember the passion and the emotions that exuberate from the Sunday school teachers during those classes.
Yeah, there's I think that's the unique feature of biblical poetry is
Yeah.
the doctrinal truth is there. You know, it's still, these poems are intended to communicate biblical truth that we're called
Yeah.
to respond to, but they also teach even through the intent is also to invoke emotion as a part of that expression. And so when we teach a poem, you know, we'll cover this later, but when you preach biblical poetry, you really need, in any passage, you need to match the tone of the passage. And so you can't teach Lamentations in a just a very, you shouldn't, I believe, teach Lamentations in a very flat way. You know, notice here we see in this text 3 attributes of God. His faithfulness is, you know, and then just make it a lecture. Certainly those are being taught there, but I think we have to match the tone and the passion of the author. But that's why, otherwise, you're right. You know, like it could have been written in a instructive way, right? Like a sermon. But Jeremiah wasn't giving a sermon there. He was pouring out his heart to God. And so I think we need to consider that when we are teaching or preaching from poetic sections of the Bible, is what is the tone or the emotion of the author being expressed here? I need to also express that as well, because that's the way in which it was given. This is the Holy Spirit inspired form of the text, as well as the words in the text. And so we don't just stir up emotion to manipulate or be fake or anything like that at all. But certainly I think it's important to consider not only what the author was saying, but how he said it, which I think really helps us segue and move to the next topic, in that this emotion is often conveyed through images. This is one of the key elements or aspects of Hebrew poetry in particular, is the imagery. And poetic devices and how they are used to convey that imagery. If you look at Hebrew poetry in general, again, the poets did not just write, you know, plain statements. They didn't write essays or lectures, but they often painted these images with their words, because those images will also have an emotional effect, an impact. You know, there's a saying in English, what is it? A picture is worth 1,000 words. And it's almost like that in Hebrew poetry, is that if a picture can be painted or described, it really shows insights and truths in a unique way. And so let me just let's look at a couple of these passages together and consider. This is Psalm 1, verses 1 to 3. Shulang, can I ask you to read this passage?
Okay. Psalm 1, verse 1 to 3. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. And in whatever he does, he prospers.
Thank you. This is only part of the psalm. I actually should have included. Let me do that. I'm going to ask you to read the rest of it here in a minute. Shulong. Should have had you read the whole psalm. Okay, can you go ahead and read verses 4 to 6 as well?
Yes. The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not rise in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For Yahweh knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish.
Okay, so notice here in this psalm, he actually gives two pictures to us, two images as he's going through, right? He's describing, he's comparing two kinds of people, right? Who are the two kinds of people he compares to in this psalm? Anybody? We have the, how blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked. And then verse 4, he says, but the wicked are not so. So he's contrasting the righteous man with the wicked, right? So the first three verses, the focus is on the righteous man. And then we see a shift in verse 4 with an emphasis on the wicked. And how he gives a picture in each section.
Yeah.
What's the picture he gives of the righteous man who delights in the law of the Lord? Verse 3. What is that picture?
It's like, in fact, there's a trees planted by streams of water, and that brings us the images back in the Garden of Eden, as well as in Revelation chapter 22.
Yes.
Of that tree that's planted by the river of life, that yields fruits in season and is evergreen.
And how is the, so it's, so as we look at this description, what's the image that comes to mind? Okay, there's streams of water, this tree is planted there. What else? How else is in this description here in verse 3? What else comes across? What does the image convey or show us?
I would say fruitfulness, what I call it, largeness, life in itself.
Okay, good. Yeah, what's the image? So there's the streams around it. It's productive, right? It's yielding fruit.
Yeah.
Maybe the tree was red, Daniel. I don't know. Prosperous.
Well, the red apples. Sustainability. I think it takes up terms of sustainability.
That will be a Chinese tree.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sustainable, right? Yields its fruit in its season, so it's ongoing, prosperous. Its leaf does not wither.
Yeah, evergreen.
Yes. And so we have this image, right, of a fertile, thriving, stable, productive, beautiful tree.
Yep.
That has around it all the resources it needs to continue to thrive. And what's that image describing? Really, who is it describing?
Who delights in the law of Yahweh.
Yeah. The righteous man who does not go the way of sinners, but delights in the law of the Lord, meditates on it. That guy, this is a picture of him. So the image sort of gives a powerful illustration of the stability of the man's life who delights in the law of the Lord and meditates day and night. And then there is the mention at the end, he goes back and says, whatever he does, he prospers. So maybe it was a red tree. There it is, prosperity gospel right here. But no, just the image though, describing the tree and the impact that would have on the original hearers. Like, yes, this person is stable and productive and fruitful and blessed. And, all of those ideas come to mind just by this description. But then notice there's another image presented in this poem. In verse 4, it's a brief statement, but it still presents an image. What is the image presented for the wicked?
The threshing floor.
Yes. And what do we know about that, Dwayne? what's the picture? What's the image these original hearers would have come to mind from what they know about the
Well, you're
threshing?
separating the wheat or the grain from the shaft or the straw. It's the wicked. They're going to be thrashed.
Yeah, that whole process. Remember, they have like these millstones where the cow would pull it around, and they'd throw the grain in, and the wheat would be crushed, and then there would be guys in there. You'll still see this today, where these pitchforks, and they're throwing the wheat up in the air, right? And so the seeds are heavy and they'll drop. But what happens with the covering of the seed, the chaff?
Yeah, I think it's winnowing actually. They are doing some winnowing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Winnowing.
So the shaft, winnowing. So the shaft gets blown away by the gusts of wind.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite image, right? Sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
So they fly off. I mean, they go off. They don't remain. The wicked are gone.
Yep. And what ends up happening with the chaff? That is, they gather it up.
They burn it.
They burn it. Right. We have that image in John the Baptist describes that in Luke 3. But yeah, just as Dwayne said, the image is quite opposite, right? We have the righteous with this vibrant tree. The wicked, though, are like this useless chaff that is easily just blown away by the wind and is useless, right? The thriving tree in verse 3 is useful, productive, blessed, it's stable, it's protected, anchored. But the wicked are described like chaff, which is the complete opposite. And so just by that one statement that he makes here, they are like chaff, which the wind drives away. Notice there's a use of a metaphor here. We'll talk about that a little bit, the word like. Compared to verse 3, he will be like a tree firmly planted. Completely opposite images. And in that culture, these images would have a strong impact because they'd be completely familiar with what the meaning of both of these images would be. It's an agrarian culture focused on agriculture. And so, right, to see these winnowing, these threshing floors, right? We're even reminded of the book of Ruth, right? Isn't that where Boaz would sleep? He was sleeping on a threshing floor. So they were very common in that culture because that's how they would process the grain. And so that image of they would have seen all around them, all the dust from the chaff as the grains being winnowed, and just and then that chaff being burned. So there'd be not only, he could have just said that, the wicked are, will be judged. They will not live a stable life. They will not prosper. But he also includes this image to make that a more impactful truth, a more impactful statement. But so he uses images here to form that contrast as well.
Yeah. And then are we talking about the chaff being burnt? It's is it in reference to let's say Gehenna, where it's a place of torment, and which the Lord was referring to, because that's what the wicked will end up in Gehenna.
Well, notice
torment and
he does talk about here, right? Where does he continue to go? The wicked will not rise in the judgment. There's a pun there, right? The chaff is thrown up in the air, but the wicked will not rise in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. The way of the wicked will perish. So certainly that connection, I think, between what is done with the chaff, the uselessness of the chaff, what is done to the chaff, I think they would understand that comparison here right away. The chaff they're like chaff. What happens to chaff? You know, it blows away in the wind and then it's burned.
Yeah.
And so he then talks about judgment. He doesn't mention burning here, but I don't think that, I think knowing the culture, I think they would have understood that connection. And then of course it's made later in the Gospels.
Mm.
You know, that the tares, chaff is tied up and burned. The wheat is preserved. So
There's so sorry.
go ahead.
No, there's another set of images in verse 1 itself, that how blessed is the man and why is he blessed? Negatively speaking, is he avoided walking, standing, and sitting in the ways of the wicked, sinners, and scoffers. So what we see, in fact, it was Spurgeon in one of his devotion years ago, where he pointed out that sin slow you down. You started by walking amongst them, and then you feel so comfortable, you sit with the seat of the scoffers, then you will stand in the ways of the sinners, and next you know, you will sit with them. You were having fellowship with them. So he cautioned very strongly that sins slow us down, and there is a progression from wickedness to sinner and to become scoffers. So I think that there's a set of images there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And this is common. The poet speaking in using images in order to communicate his point. Another example, let's look at one in Joel. Let's see. Philip, could you read this one for us? Joel 1, 4 through 7 here.
Sure.
Thank you.
Joel chapter 3 or 1, verses 4 to 7. What the knowing locust has left, the swarming locust has consumed. And what the swarming locust has left, the creeping locust has consumed. And what the creeping locust has left, the stripping locust has consumed. Awake, drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you wine drinkers, on account of the sweet wine that is cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come up against my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has made my wine a desolation and my fig trees splinters. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become white.
All right, thank you. So what's the image or images, excuse me, that are presented here? What do we see here in Joel? What's being described as he begins in verse 4? Pastor Philip, I'll ask you first, since you read the text. What does he first describe here in verse 4 that has taken place?
Is that my pronunciation right? Is that knowing locust? What the knowing locust has left? Locust.
Yeah. Notice there's this focus on the locusts that have come, right? They've suffered a locust plague. people of Judah. And so he sort of emphasizes that, right, by these three kinds of locusts that have come and just consumed everything. But then he presents a picture or a few pictures after that, to really, I think, heighten the emotion of the impact of this plague. And notice, what are those pictures that he describes here in verses 5 to 7?
How about the drunkard?
Yeah, the first one is the, drunkards or wine drinkers, right? And what is the image there? And others can answer too. I'm not just picking on Pastor Philip, but if anyone wants to add their thoughts, what's the image of these as he talks about these drunkards, these wine drinkers?
Is it weep and wail?
Yeah. See, right, kind of the pictures, you know, the guys right in town who are in the English, we call them the town drunks, where they just, you see the guys over, they're always drunk or drugs or high. And so he gives first an image of those guys. You know, they had them back in the old days too, in the days of Israel. They had drunkards in town as well. And but what's the picture that he gives of them? How does he describe them here?
In fact, from verse 4, my take is that God has has hurled so much and so devastating the punishment on them by, it is the description in verse 4 of a total destructions that what the four types of locusts that's totally consumed the land. And God is telling the Israelites, by such a devastating consequences and judgment, how come they are not awakened to the punishment that has been inflicted on them because of their sin? And then verse 5 is saying that the extent of the destructions, even the drunkards will be awakened. I mean, a drunk person is like, he lost all kinds of senses, and he's awakened from his drunkenness, and he'll start weeping. It's a very grotesque, I suppose, description of the extensive destruction that God is telling Israelites, have I gotten your attention?
Yeah.
Are you ready to repent?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think, there's really four images here, these 4 verses that we read. The first image is just of the devastation of the locusts. So you can kind of picture these waves of locusts just coming through. And then verse 5 is sort of the effect, the result of that is that the town drunks, are awake now and they're weeping because they can't find any more booze, no more wine, because it's all gone, been consumed. And then he moves to another image in verse 6 of an army that's come upon them, like an army of lions that is just devoured. And then verse 7, another image of crops that have been destroyed. And notice he says it stripped them bare, cast them away. Their branches had become white. So they ate the bark off of the trees and the vines, which is a death sentence for them, right? The bark is their protection. So when the bark is gone, the covering is gone and they're going to die. So it's not just that they've consumed for the present, that there'll be no crops, but actually those crops are not coming back. But notice he could have, Joel could have stood up and just said, we've just experienced this awful locust plague. This is God's judgment on us, and we need. But he decides to sort of present these images. It's kind of like a, like a story, just where he's presenting these images in order to really emphasize the impact. So
yeah, you've got to have agricultural background in order to understand this.
Yeah.
I've never seen a locust plague, but I've seen hailstorms just destroy a field, just tear it down. And of course, then you have this taking the liquor away from a drunkard. Boy, are they going to howl. I remember my son-in-law was a policeman, and he stopped the car, and he took the liquor away, and they just cried. They wanted that liquor. It's kind of like when you take a handphone away from somebody that's addicted to a handphone, that they'll steal. They'll fight for that handphone. It's just too cruel. And then, of course, you have that the rate. I've seen dogs, not a lion. I don't live where lions were, but dogs can make a mess of things, and they can really do a lot of damage. And then, of course, a garden that has had army worms come through and just eat off everything. Well, this world is dangerous. This world has got a lot of things that are very destructive. And here we got a bunch of destruction.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, Dwayne, about just the experience of the original audience. And so they would understand, that culture would understand. Dwayne, you said just the importance of understanding agriculture. Yeah, for sure, because we can understand it intellectually, maybe to some extent, but if we were actually farmers and lived there, and it would be even more significant, more impactful. We'd have more insight into the importance of and the meaning of that particular image, because that would be part of our experience. So, like you said, you've seen dust or hailstorms come through, and how the destructive power of those, yeah, I've never been in a locust plague either. I've seen it on TV at times, videos, but just that image to them would be even more emotionally impactful. Like if you talk to me about earthquakes, I've been in some strong earthquakes and seen the devastation of it, and I've felt my heart in the middle of a significant earthquake, and the fear and the helplessness. So when someone talks about an earthquake, I have an experience that adds to or magnifies what the author is emphasizing or pointing out just from that experience. So this is why, we've talked a lot about background of books and things like that. What's the cultural background? Well, it's pretty important. And so just like Dwayne pointed out, understanding the culture and the background here as best we can will enhance our ability to understand the effect of, the importance of the image that the poet is describing. And so here, yeah, and I thought it's just interesting to me that the different scenes that Joel describes, pointing to the drunkards first. Yeah, and they're just like wailing, right? Weeping because their alcohol is gone. And so then turning to the describing these locusts like an army of lions, they're devouring. And then, of course, the last image of a garden, of a vineyard that's been completely stripped bare. These would have an effect on the hearers.
Yeah. I so happened to preach on Joel chapter 1, 2 in my church, or the whole book rather, 2022. So I did a bit of Googling about the swarm of locusts. And to my own shock, that a kilometer swarm of locusts, a kilometer square swarm of locusts can eat up the food for 35,000 people in one day. A kilometer square of locust swarm can eat up the food for 35,000 people in one day. And in 1954, when the swarm of locusts invaded Kenya and devoured an area of 200 kilometers square, that works out to be that swarm of locusts has eaten up food for 7 million people in one day.
Yeah.
And that is just to tell us the seriousness of the judgment. And in fact, in the book of Joel, the imagery, the emotions is very intense because this is a harvest time. It is supposed to be a joyful time. And lo and behold, the 4 types of locusts totally devastated everything. The anticipated joy of the harvest time is now replaced with the wailing and the weeping because of the total devastation. And I think when, I also saying if we got into that, I don't know, for me, it gets into me. And I was like, God, how am I supposed to preach all this? It become heavy in my own heart. And then you look at the next imagery of the drunkard and the what's this? The drunkard and what's the other guy now? The drunkard and the drinkers. And who are they? If I know a pastor team will talk about the street, what do you call it? The street.
The town drunk.
A town drunk, right? What is the mainstay of their life? It is pleasure seeking, numbing themselves with alcohol. And now they are awakened. They are called to wail.
Yeah, it reminds like in Proverbs, right? It's describing the drunkard, and he says, when he wakes up, he says, where will I find another drink? It's like that's all that they think about. And so
Oh, we was wandering down the street in India when we were there, and there was this guy laying there. He had a nice white cloth around him, but he was dead drunk. He had vomited, and the flies had collected, and they were crawling in and out of his mouth. And then on top of that, he had diarrhea, and that he had messed himself. It was a sad situation with all the flies, and he was just the happiest guy in the world, laying there in his vomit and in his diarrhea. I'll never forget that scene. And then the flies that were there. Oh, it was. Today we have drug addicts, and they the same way. It just dissipates and destroys. But the destruction. This is one very, very vile and destructive world. It's not a pretty place at all. If you get into families and see what's going on, get into communities, it's pretty ugly. There's a lot of sad things going on. And it's all sin, and it's death. And the wages of sin, and Satan's ragings that destroys. It's all over the place. And it's really, really active these days. Wow, the things we've seen.
And that, I think, when even we can learn as an example these in our own teaching and preaching, to draw upon images, draw upon experiences of the culture and experiences of your hearers to heighten or deepen or enrich or bring a stronger emotional effect to the point that you're making. This is where illustrations can be very impactful.
And this guy was as happy as could be. He was just rolling around in this stuff, and everybody was cutting a wide path around him, but he was enjoying himself, and the flies were enjoying him too. And he wasn't a poor man. He was out cold. He was moaning and groaning, but I'll never forget that. That was well. It's Oh, yeah. It's,
Yeah.
it's sobering.
Yeah, so here, here Joel draws upon that image of those guys that now all of a sudden, normally, yeah, they're laying around, get drunk, but now they're all up, they're awake, they're crying out. So just
well, alcohol is a depressant, and then you have the others that are what are they called? They're
yeah,
not the
the
they give
opposite.
high, and they can go for 2 or 3 days without sleeping.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember the term, but I know what you're talking about.
Mhm.
And so this is a very, very common tool, common characteristic of Hebrew poetry is the imagery. And so when you studying Hebrew poetry, or any poetry really, but biblical poetry is, look for those images and then identify what the original hearers, the original audience, how would they have understood that image? What would have been the impact of that particular image to them? Just like, again, you might use an illustration that is common to the experience, your experience, and those of your hearers, and how that would affect them. Well, it's helpful and important identifying that impact to the original audience, because that's the thing that then we want to sort of translate or bring to. So like if you're preaching this in the Midwest, Dwayne, you'll talk about the locust, but then you may bring in as an illustration, like, remember 30 years ago, that hailstorm that destroyed, or the tornado that came through, or whatever. You would use an experience common to your hearers to help bring the emotional impact. What's that?
As I'm talking about tornadoes, that brings up another a bunch of stories. We had a tornado go through a 90 or 100 acre farm or field, a cornfield, and it cut a path, and it was about 250 feet where it sucked up everything. There just was bare dirt, and then it was 1,000 feet on both sides was sucked in, and of course there was a lot of trees and other stuff that had dropped all over. What a mess that was. I wasn't home when it went through, but my mother was out taking pictures of it, and she thought it was really exciting. Well, well, anyway, that was a tornado.
Yeah, the devastation sometimes those can bring.
Oh, the power of that.
My
And
mother
they
said,
said it shook the ground, it roared. So
yeah. And so that's an experience that you can draw upon if you want to communicate, the devastation or power or something like that. And so that's exactly what these poets are doing. It's just, and Jesus was a master of that as well, right? He would take everyday situations or events or pictures, things around him, and use those as an illustration for particular biblical truths. And so it's a very effective method for communicating truth, because when you can affect the emotions of a person, I think, you Chai, you were mentioning that they can better comprehend or appreciate the point being made. So that this is I think where poetry can be a very helpful form of communication. So next time we'll look into, how the use of figurative language to convey these images, and so we'll spend a little time looking at figurative language, figures of speech, poetic devices that are used, things to look for when you're studying biblical poetry, because identifying those devices can help you better appreciate and understand the poet and the point that he's making. But it's already end of our time tonight, so I want to let you guys go. But any final remarks before we close our time tonight? Well, it's good to see you guys. Let me ask Brother Dwayne, would you close us in prayer?